it's been a failure, this video is for you. When we make basic bread, we only use 4 ingredients: flour, salt, yeast, and water. Nothing else is necessary. Now, about flour, the easiest, especially if you're a beginner, is to use white bread flour. You can have it organic, stone ground, whatever. What I have here is just regular flour that I bought at the supermarket. Now, the first thing we have to do is get the yeast going. Yeast is the heart and soul of your bread. And now we are about to activate the yeast. I have here a 1/4 cup of water, into which I'm going to put in a little bit of sugar and a tablespoon of yeast. Now I'm going to stir it up a bit, mix it in. Doesn't have to be perfectly mixed in. Take a look here. See, it looks kind of rough. That's okay. Now I could have used less yeast. Now I'm going to put my yeast and sugar water mixture in a warm place, and we're going to proof the yeast. You'll see later what that means. Now, while the yeast is proofing, I said I could have used less yeast, which would have probably been fine, except I plan on adding some nuts and cranberries to this and making the dough heavier, so I'm going to need more lifting power. So a full tablespoon of yeast is a good idea. Now, take my mixing bowl, my flour, and 2 cups of water. Pour 2 cups of water into the bowl. I'm going to add the salt now. Some people say you should add the salt later because the salt may inhibit the action of the yeast. Well, maybe, but I don't worry about that. I have a tablespoon of salt here, a little under a tablespoon actually, which I'm going to now add to my water, and I'm ready to start making dough. I have some flour here. For 2 cups of water, it'll probably take about 6 cups of flour to get good dough. It's the amount of water that determines how much dough, how much flour I'm going to require. So now I'm just mixing it in. See, it's very easy. I could have warmed the water up before on the stove if I wanted to, and it would have been good for the yeast. Now, look here what's happening. It's starting just barely to leave the edges of the bowl. Now, what I'm going to do to develop the gluten is an optional step. I'm going to stir and stir and stir. The easiest is to count 100 times. I think I'll add a little more flour because it's pretty liquid. Now, with the extra flour that I just added, I'm starting to get dough. Still stirring to develop the gluten strands. And you can see the stringiness. That stringiness is due to the gluten. Now, the gluten forms during this procedure. And you can see there's more and more stringiness. Now we're going to check our yeast to see if it's proofed. Now look at that, the nice foam. It's all foamy. That tells us that the yeast is working. There you go, nice foamy yeast. And that we're going to add to the dough. Just going to unceremoniously dump it in. See, I just dumped it right on top, and I'm going to mix it in. To my dough, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1 tablespoon of oil. These are optional ingredients. There we go. And mix it in. There was only a 1/4 cup of water with that yeast, but it's changed the consistency of the dough quite a bit. So we're ready to add more flour. As I said earlier, no need to measure. It's the water that will determine how much flour this recipe will require, but it'll be about 6 cups. Now we're getting to the stage where the spoon is becoming more of a hindrance than a help. So I'm going to take a little bit of flour, cover that, and clean the dough off the spoon and get rid of the spoon. So now I have dough. I'm going to dump a bunch of flour on top and start pushing it in using my clean hands. Now at this stage, the dough is very sticky, gooey, messy. So I have lots of flour and I'm ready to dump it out of the bowl onto my surface. And we use flour generously. I get all this out of here. Now I have lots of flour. I have my very sticky dough, but I'm keeping lots of flour between my hands and the gooey dough. And of course, the dough is absorbing the flour. This is very easy. I'm not using any force, just gently pushing down. All the time, I'm appreciating the feeling of the dough, and that just takes experience. You can see the flour I put on is rapidly being taken up by the dough, which is still very soft. We have a very soft dough here, very high moisture content. So I'll add some more flour. Spread it around. Fold the dough over. Push it. And I can feel the dough changing while I'm doing this. It's still not anywhere near ready. But when I push it in, it's starting to bounce back a little bit. Push it in, bounces back a bit. Not very much though. So, keep going. Now this is my favorite part of making bread, is the kneading. And it definitely does not have to be difficult or strenuous. You shouldn't be working too hard. Now, about those optional ingredients, I'm going to be adding walnuts and cranberries soon. You always add your optional ingredients later. The later the better, because things like cranberries, raisins, walnuts, wheat bran, wheat germ, they will all hinder the development of the gluten. They'll be shortening the length of the gluten strands. That you don't want. This is starting to get a little stiffer, which is what I want. Now when I push in, maybe hard to tell here, but it springs back a little more. So we're getting there. I've been kneading this now maybe for 5 minutes. And the flour I've added is mostly absorbed. And so I think at this stage, I'm ready to add my optional ingredients. Now for some optional ingredients. In this case, I have about 3/4 of a cup of cranberries, and I poured boiling water over them to plump them and soften them. Otherwise, when you bake them, they'll probably come out as hard pellets. So I'm just going to put the plumped cranberries on top. And I have chopped and roasted in a frying pan some walnuts. So this is cranberry walnut bread. And I'm going to continue mixing. Now this is a step, obviously, that adds some complication. Now, by folding and refolding and kneading the dough, the walnuts and the cranberries will be mixed and spread evenly throughout the dough. It won't be in a layer the way it looks there. Whenever you add optional ingredients like nuts, raisins, grated carrots, mashed potatoes, wild rice, whatever you want to add to your bread is fine. But always add it after you've let the gluten develop and you've kneaded it a bit. So we're just kneading this perhaps a little longer than I normally would because I want the nuts and the cranberries to be evenly distributed throughout the dough. I have more nuts here, so we'll just dump the whole thing right there. Now, I didn't have to roast the nuts beforehand, but I figured it would be better, it would taste better if I did. Now our dough is getting nice, getting stiffer. Stiffer and stiffer. You can roll it, you can fold it, you can do whatever you want. The more I knead it, the more I'm developing the gluten. So now, after a few minutes of kneading and mixing, I have a good even distribution of my walnuts and cranberries in the dough. And what I'm going to show you now is when I push down on it and then let it go, you see how it's coming back? That's the elasticity of the gluten. You can do that again. And it comes back. It's still coming back. Or when I push my finger in, you can see how it comes back. It doesn't come all the way back, but it comes back. It's elastic. So what I'm going to do now is roll it into a ball. You see underneath here all this junk inside. That's not a problem. I roll it in and I make a ball out of it. Now, here's my bowl, which I haven't cleaned. I'm going to toss a little bit of flour in. You could butter the bowl or oil it. I don't think it's necessary. I take my flour, I drop it in, and add a little bit of flour on top. Just throw this flour over like that. And then I'm going to cover it. If you put a damp dishcloth right against the dough, later on after it's risen and you pull the damp dishcloth off, it'll probably have all kinds of gooey dough stuck to it. What I find works really well is wax paper or parchment paper that I just put on the top of the bowl and it keeps the humidity in. So now I have a warm oven, not hot, warm. You don't want to kill the yeast. I'm going to close the door. I leave the oven light on for heat. So leave your oven light on. And that's it. We'll come back and check it out in about a half an hour. Approximately 45 minutes later, let's see what we got. Ho ho! It looks like it's more than doubled in bulk. Usually you let it double in bulk and then you go to the next step. This looks like a little bigger. Something about when you let your dough rise, you don't have to do it in a warm oven. You can just let it rise at room temperature, and that gives you a little more leeway, more time. Maybe you have to go out and do things. So you can either do it in a warm oven, room temperature, or you can even stall it by putting it in the fridge. That gives you a little leeway. So watch what I'm going to do here. This is my fist. That's the dough. And bang! Watch, it's shrinking, 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 shrinking. A little bit of a blister here. You can just do that. So now I'm going to pull this out and plop it down there. So put our hands on it, work it. Now the feeling I have is that it's dry enough that I don't have to add more flour. But sometimes when you pull it out of the first rising, it might be really tacky or sticky and you might need to use more flour. But we don't have to do that. Feels pretty good. Now you can let your dough rise any number of times, 2, 3, 4 times. You can let it rise at room temperature in a warm oven. It depends on your schedule. So I'm just sort of mixing things in, packing it down. Now the next step is to divide the dough into 2 even loaves. So I will use a sharp knife and cut it in half. You don't want to tear your dough in half. You want to use a sharp knife to cut it, because that will have less of an effect on the gluten. Now, here's 1 loaf of bread. All I'm going to do is shape it. I'm rolling it up, then compressing. The idea is basically to get it, forming it into a loaf. And at the bottom here, your folds will disappear, hopefully. I need a little more flour because it's getting a bit sticky. So here I have 1 loaf of bread. I'm rolling it out a little bit. I'm shaping it so it'll fit in the pan. And then I plop it in the pan, and I can shape it a little more to fit into the pan. I can stretch it, whatever needs to be done to get it to fit. So there's 1 loaf. Oh, and here's what it looks like after I've cut it, with my walnuts and cranberries. So here I'm just rolling out the second piece of dough, shaping it into a loaf. And I should mention that this bread pan, I greased it, and then I sprinkled a little bit of flour inside, and that will make it so that the bread won't stick after it's cooked. And now I'm shaping the loaf. Now we have 2 loaves all ready to go, and now they're ready for the second rising. Now our loaves have been in the oven for about 30 minutes. They rise faster the second time because there's more yeast. And here we are. Here's our loaves. So what I'm going to do now is turn the oven on to 350 degrees. And when the oven has reached 350, we'll put our loaves into the oven. So after about 20-25 minutes at 350 degrees, we can see what our bread looks like. There's 1 loaf. Here's the other loaf. Now one thing you might notice is that the bread has risen even more after when I first put it in, and that's called oven spring. Because when you put the bread in the oven, the yeast continues to function, and it gives off kind of a last minute orgy of activity and causes the bread to rise a little more, and you get what's called oven spring. So here we are, our 2 loaves cooked for roughly 20 minutes at 350. And now we're going to wait a little while before cutting into it, because it's so hot and soft in the middle that if we cut it, it'll crush the bread. So we're going to wait about 10-15 minutes, and then stay tuned. We're going to cut into it. And now we are finally here, the moment when we can cut into our beautiful loaf and eat it. So here we go. I'm going to cut with a serrated knife, of course, is much better. Cut into the loaf, and there you go. There. That is the end of our story.
And
Delicious.
with butter, it's even better. Thank you, Neil.